From Wakefield, it's the Nolan Carr Night Show, inviting you to join Nolan and his guest this week, Andrew Nicholls, to the show. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here's Nolan.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of the show. Joining me this week is a big time guest. Before I introduce who this person is, I hope you all enjoyed last week's episode. If you did, of course, subscribe, comment, share all that fun jazz and social media. Like, comment, share, subscribe, all on the audio and visual platforms as well. And it's always a treat doing this show every week, or at least I try to do every week. Sometimes I can't get somebody, but nevertheless, this week we have someone who certainly fits the build of what I'm going to say, and it's always a pleasure to talk to people with insightful and interesting stories. And this person certainly does as well. Although my guest this week originates across the Atlantic Ocean back to the motherland before a trip up north, he's now called home to the Golden State, where he has made he's made a name as one of the premier wondrous wordsmiths of writing on small market syndicated programs like Jimmy Neutron, Fairly Odd Parents, Barbie Dreamland Adventure, and the head writer of some program called The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, along with his longtime collaborator and friend Darryl Vickers. It is my immense honor and privilege to have His Eminence himself, the Andrew Nicholls, as our guest this week. Andrew, how are you?
I am good. How are you? Good to be here.
It's always a treat, and I was the last, and I'm sure I'll mention this again throughout this interview, but the last few days, at least since we spoke, or originally corresponded over email, been watching clips from your old place of office and residency at the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson and Jonathan Winters and things of that nature. So this is a real treat. So thanks again.
Yeah, and you're most welcome. And yeah, I do occasionally have them pop up, not only from friends who worked on the show, but of course, if you're on social media, a lot of people will find something amazing, amusing, or appropriate, and then put up something that and it comes on the screen, and I think, wait a minute, I had something to do with that. You know,
Yeah.
it's like the brain cells in the back start to go, whoa, whoa. It was
Sure.
a long time ago, but
Oh
it
yeah.
was vibrant. Yeah.
Well, also a moment where you are pure adrenaline, I'm sure, so you don't really let it sink in to an extent. To then years later, you're like, oh, I forgot I was on that for a quick second.
Adrenaline is right. Yeah, we were there for 6 years, and I'm still dreaming about it. And they're generally not good dreams. They're the the anxiety dreams.
Yeah.
They're in your pajamas in the high school hallway kind of dreams. But it's always that the monologue is not finished, and the show's starting in 10 minutes, and there's no props, or I have to carve a co-host out of butter or something like that. Yeah.
That would be interesting. A fill-in host of butter. Well, I want to start like this because this is how I usually go. And your story is similar to a few other people within your writing industry have experienced a certain not I don't say depression, but sort of sad aspect of society the last few months across the country, but primarily in California, where a lot of the studios are. And now with COVID, we're back open to the main sort of life of things, if you want to call it back to normal, and entertainment's been able to be enjoyed in person. So for you, for somebody who's been involved with this industry most of their life, what's it been like from your perspective to see these movies and television shows to be enjoyed publicly again?
Well, the again is weird for me because I'm not much of a consumer of entertainment. And I realized, probably decades ago that I really had done my most intense like television watching in particular, and movie going when I was in my teens and 20s. And then once we actually managed to get to Hollywood, which is a whole trick in itself, Darryl Vickers and I, it was just nonstop work,
Sure.
and I didn't really want to watch television after writing television all day. You know, if
Yeah.
you're walking up and down in a fake living room with fake stairs and a fake kitchen for 12 hours, you don't really want to go home, turn on the TV, and watch another fake kitchen. And so,
Yeah.
I started reading a lot instead. The last few months, I've been going to plays more often because that has been a drought in theater. You know, they
Sure.
physically you had to be there, and so they had to close.
Yeah.
And it just came back from seeing a few things in San Francisco and here, and that's nice. Yeah, but I'm not the small waivers in what's going on in TV and in streaming have mostly not affected me, especially since I tend to avoid comedy since I
Sure.
kind of know the tricks.
Yeah.
So I watch, shoot 'em ups and alien stuff
Yeah.
and mysteries. Anything that I can't guess the ending. With comedies, I'm always feels like I'm close to being
Yeah.
ahead.
Hopefully, during the last few years, this has given all of us a time to reflect on ourselves and learn things that we didn't know prior. So, for Andrew Nicholls, what is one thing he learned about himself that he didn't know prior?
Hmm. I'm reasonably self-aware. In fact, I would say more than reasonably. I tend to plumb my inner states pretty well. And whatever I've learned is probably embarrassing. So I'll try and dig around for, let's see, something that I have a pretty it would have surprised me if you told me like 15 or 20 years ago that I don't have much patience with poor entertainment, with things that are poorly done.
Sure.
And I've been thinking a lot about the way things are done, especially during the current strike, which now in August of 23, we're in 130 days, or is it 113 days today? I've been through 4 strikes with the WGA. But talking to writers, and I spent a lot of time in animation, and where your collaborators, you didn't meet them. Your scripts would be passed back and forth by email pretty well since like 1997 when I started doing cartoons. And so now I'm actually walking and talking to mildly disgruntled writers and comparing my experiences with theirs and hearing all about the hardships of young writers who have it. I mean, I didn't ever think that we had an easy job. It took us 7 years to get out of radio and stage and get down to Hollywood and just start writing a few things. But now it seems like it's almost insurmountable. And listening to them and then saying, oh, what was it like, seeing an old guy walking with what was it like when you started, and telling them the stories, I realized that a lot of my stories aren't just the, oh, wow, and then we got to work with this celebrity kind of thing. A lot of them are, we got, screwed over by this studio, and then we got bounced out of there, and then they dropped our deal here and there. And I think it has put a rind around me. I try to be generally fairly happy-go-lucky, even more so, I think, than most comedy writers who are an introspective bunch, often quite depressive. Just because there's an old saying, a bad childhood is the writer's toolbox. And I think a miserable childhood is often the comedy writer's toolbox. But I had an okay upbringing in England and then in Canada, but I think it has surprised me to realize that I'm a little more cynical than I thought I was.
Sure. Well, I know, starting back as far as we can, as far as we want to, I know, going from England to then eventually Canada, where you meet Darryl, you were a well-rounded kid in terms of reading, someone who was always reading. I know A. Mills' poems, Wizard of Oz, the Oxford Encyclopedia, and Tove Jansson was another thing of yours in terms of reading, compared to maybe watching stuff on television. When did you realize that you had a ability to create stuff through writing at a young age, seeing as you were someone who could read all these creative elements?
Well, also I had what they call an eidetic memory, so I could, even after I'd read a book, I remember when finishing The Wizard of Oz, and it was before I left England, so it was maybe 7 or 8, but I realized that if someone opened it anywhere and started reading from it, I could tell them what page it was on, what side of the page, and maybe even continue the sentence a little. So I had that slight obsessiveness young. And I think at 6 or 7, I wrote a little story, which my father helped me illustrate and print. He was a printer and publisher. So I had this little booklet called Bleep and Booster Go to the Moon. So I actually got to say that or dictate it and partly write it, and then have little tinfoil rocket ships made and have a book which was stapled together. So that was probably, so at 7 or 8, I realized you can do this. But for the longest time, and even when I started writing with Darryl when we were both 12, we were only 3 days apart. We were born 3 days apart in England, though we never met until we were 12. But I started to realize that there were people who did this. I just hadn't thought, it wasn't very worldly. I didn't realize that. I mean, I used to watch the Flintstones, which was on in England and Canada and the States. Everyone got the Flintstones, and then the Tove Jansson, the Moomin Troll books, which I would read. But the thought that it was a living, and people's parents go to work and that's what they do. They make stories about a caveman who puts his dinosaur out for the night. It took me a long time to think about that. I was keen on writing poems, short stories and things, but even embarrassingly, maybe even into my 20s, I don't think I had any idea that you could make enough to buy a house, and we're going back to there, by the way. But I can remember getting my first offer on a show. Darryl and I were offered, a fixed amount of money, and hearing it and being really, really excited. And look back at how embarrassingly small that was now, because, they didn't expect us to last 5 weeks, and they thought, let's just toss them this. We got a check when we were, I don't know, 19 or 20. We sent some cartoon ideas off to Bob Thaves, and he was in California. We never met him, but we wrote for him for 20 years. He wrote a strip called Frank and Ernest. And when that first check came, it was only for, I think, $125. But holding that check
Yeah.
a U.S. bank for just for words we'd written, and he was going to draw them, and then later on we cut them out of the newspaper. That was it was a thrill, of course, but also it was like a surprise. Like it felt like we cheated somebody. Like they're going to pay us for this. Yeah, and then there'll be more money after this. He's asked us for more jokes. I think we sent him, we wrote like 200 the next day, and then reined ourselves in and only sent him 25.
Yeah. Now you mentioned, being marveling at the fact that someone could make money about writing about a caveman and putting his dinosaur out at night in front of his house. Maybe not even that watching on television, but when you were able to start writing stories yourself, did you have any inspirations from television? Seeing in the 70s and 60s, there was a treasure trove of sitcoms and things of that nature on that time.
It's funny that Darryl and I, so we met, and it's Canada, not England. We still had the British background, but so did a fair number. The 60s were there were a lot of emigration from Britain to Canada. Wide open homes were cheap, huge yard. Monty Python grabbed us when it started airing. I think it started production in 69, and maybe got onto, they were playing it on PBS across the lake from us in the States, in Buffalo, by 71 or 72. We were just enthralled by that show. It was a continuum, because it was the type of humor that we'd had on the playground in England, the Goon Show, then the Pythons, just the silliness.
Sure.
Meanwhile, at about that time, Norman Lear was starting his American sitcom. So there was All in the Family, and then later Maude, and I could, and we would watch them, and then, we're 12, and we would talk the next morning and say, like, how come this one was so funny? And how come this other one, it's like just a bunch of people sitting around complaining with a joke every now and then? It seemed boring. It seemed tedious. If you could write anything you wanted, why have someone go to work and come home from work and talk about what work was like? Like, you could have, giant foot come down and stomp people, or a 16-ton weight land on an opera singer. It took probably a few years. We're probably into our teens, and we were still obsessed with the Pythons, and have since managed to work slightly with a couple of them, to realize that it really was a difference. And Canada was midway, and you could write a joke, a sketch that was very silly, absurd, Python-esque, and get it on Canadian radio. You couldn't get it on American radio. There was nowhere here. Just as SNL was so much more based on making fun of commercials or making fun of some business than even in Canada, SCTV, and those guys would just loop off into craziness every now and then. So when we crossed the border, we did have to adapt, and we moved into the world, of course, of the things which at 12 or 13 we had said, why aren't these any funnier? Because we also made lists of, so at 13 or 14, my dad was a printer, and so he'd bring him home all this paper that he couldn't use, in terrible colors that no one would ever order. So I had this to sketch and write on and type on, and we would list the show we'd seen, who directed it, and who wrote it. And every now and then we would come up with something that was 4 stars, brilliant, very, very funny. And then, like, I'd noticed down the page, here's the same writer doing an episode of something else, Three's Company, and it was terrible. And I was thinking, well, how could the same writer who did something so good here be so? And then, of course, it took us a while to learn that the name of the writer on the show is just the person who wrote the first draft. And the staff, whoever was on staff, would and the cast and the director and the network and the studio and the standards and practices people would all go and perform their magic on it. After that. And we've had a few shows, 3 shows out of the 130 or so that we've done, 130 series and pilots, where it was just a dream every bit of the way. And those were the shows where there was some strong person involved, Johnny Carson or John Landis. We did a show called Campus Cots with John Landis, and those people just said, no, we're going to do it the way you wrote it. And those were the great times.
Sure. Speaking of Darryl, obviously you said you met him at 12 years old in Canada after he similarly came from England. In another interview done a while ago, you talked about how you see things through your eyes, and he sees things through, or reads things through his ears, and it completely opposite of who you are, but somehow creatively that works so well together.
Yeah, it's very strange.
In most scenarios like that, there probably is a lot of conflict and stuff, but to work together on a show like with Johnny Carson, all the other things you were part of successfully, what did that mean to find someone like that for you, that although you might not agree on everything, but somehow you made the magic work?
Yeah, and I don't even know if we did find the other person, because considering at 12, 11 or 12, you're still not very well formed, and it could be that we grew into the things that each was not, that the other was not very good at. Like
Sure.
I can spell and format. My strength is like I said in that interview, whatever that was, the visual. So I'm a crossword Scrabble guy, and and poetry, and I read a lot of novels, and so I was good at, if we needed to put something in that was scientific, physical, mathematics.
Sure.
Whereas Darryl, I mean, you walk through a mall and he will say, that singer, she was this other band in the 70s. He
Yeah.
has amazing auditory capacity. He's also a massive, some would say, insane record collector. But also he has history and geography, which completely befuddle me. I have no sense of direction. You could spin him around in a field and he could point north. I very much dislike talking on the phone, and I don't do that many interviews. He could talk on the phone for like an hour and a half. It runs in his family. In each case, there seemed to be that one of us was whatever one of us was strong at, the other one wasn't necessarily. If we were on a difficult show with a difficult everything, we did a talk show with Magic Johnson for a while at Fox, and I'd be in a room typing sketches as fast as I could, looking at upcoming guests, what can we do, and just typing. And someone had to be going out and arguing with people or saying, no, you see, this is what you do. Here's the joke. And so Darryl fit naturally into that. And so, you got one person steering and one person pedaling. And I still, after 54 years of working with him, I don't know if we started that way and that was just a good fit, or if we actually grew to take up the weaknesses in the other person's writing.
Well, it probably is a combination of both, because that's all you know of each other, and then you're just so used to it that it's like second nature to some aspect. Prior to working on Carson with him, when did you realize that you both had something in terms of writing together?
Oh, right away. Yeah, we started fooling around, pulling like little practical jokes with people. And also we were 12 and he had written a novel about the Second World War already, called How to Die in Europe on $5 a Day. So automatically, you don't meet many 12 or 13-year-olds who'd written a novel. He'd also written a short story I thought was very funny called Can Man Eat Truck, about somebody cutting a car up and eating it in pieces. And I was drawing cartoons and telling jokes. And he had a Christmas party in 1969. So, we're this tall. Beatles still hadn't broken up, or maybe they had. And he said, I heard you played the guitar. And I said, yeah. He said, did you write your own songs, or can you do I said, a little bit of each. So he invited me to play his Christmas party that year. So it was a classmates, just and me sitting on my amp and playing songs. And the next day he called me up and said, I play the guitar a little bit too. Maybe we could write some things together. So it was music first.
Sure.
And then we discovered that the songs we were writing were all ridiculous or funny or about someone with elbows so wide they couldn't get out the door or something, whatever makes a 12-year-old laugh. And we had a music career in Canada for a while. We got radio airplay on stuff we recorded right after I got out of college. But there was no money in it. You're going from bar to bar and making money, maybe. And you're desperately hoping that people come in off the street, so you get another $3 at the door. Yeah. But we're starting to write funnier stuff and funnier stuff for radio and local plays. And at some point, somebody did come to us and offer to manage us as the band, and he had his whole proposal worked out. We had airplay and we were on a record, and we looked at each other and thought, that would definitely take us in that direction. And we've been there. People are coming up and asking us to sign things between sets, but we made $20 last night.
Sure.
Maybe we shouldn't lock in. And I guess at that point, so we're 21, we thought, we turned them down and said, I think we're going to write jokes instead.
Now I read somewhere, and I don't know, you can never truly believe Wikipedia, but I read that, you and Darryl's group, Nobby Clegg and the Civilians, there was some connection to the Who with Roger Daltrey. How much of that is true, and what was that experience like?
So our band, we had written a song, a 6-minute dirge about a kid whose father was dying of black lung, working in a coal mine in the north of England. And this was the song that busted us out. It's on YouTube now. It's called My Old Man, or Me Dad's. It was the original title by Nobby Clegg. Nobby with just an N. And It was big in Canada. It got played in, because it was about coal mining, got played in Wales and in Portugal and in West Virginia. And years later, with that years behind us, we wrote a script for a Cockney alcoholic for the Sherilyn Fenn, Lynn Redgrave Showtime series, Rude Awakening. And so she was going to rehab every week. We thought it would be funny if some very famous rock star has also been court ordered and has to go. And all of a sudden, like Billy, Sherilyn Fenn's character, is really excited that this alcoholic rock star is going to be sitting next to her. You know, she tapes off his seat like it's reserved. And so we wrote the script and they sent it around to casting agents, and Roger Daltrey read it and said he'd like to play the part. He had bought a house in the valley and he'd like to do carpentry, and he was here anyway, helping the carpenters like put new stairs in or something. And so there were a couple of episodes of that show with this character in them, but we had given him the name Nobby Clegg because it didn't seem to us like anybody at Showtime was going to have heard of our band.
Sure.
I don't know how many records, if any, we sold. And when we were getting played, it was usually by some DJ in Australia. And so nobody knew, nobody legally checked it, I guess. And Roger liked the scripts, and after that show ended, we spent a little while with him trying to sell a show called The Roadie Monologues. We were trying to think of a format which could have Roger in it, but where he wouldn't have to spend every day shooting scenes. And we thought, if again he had been court ordered to tell a story about his debauched, drunken, drugged rock star life every week, we could have him tapping the microphone at a ladies auxiliary group and saying, "Oh, it's really good to be here. Yeah, you shouldn't do drugs. I remember this one time." And then we could just go to behind the scenes, backstage, these crazy, stupid roadies doing terrible things, and wouldn't need Roger all that much. We pitched it around for a while. Everybody wanted to take the pitch. Nobody bought it. I think they all just want to get their copy of Who's Next signed. Sure. So that was fun.
But it's a moment where you look back and that 1 degree of separation that you have with the rock legends, such as that, I'm sure is another moment that you say, how did that happen? There's a video out there, and there was a skit maybe they did at SNL a while ago when Bill Hader was on. He does a magnificent impression of someone he also wrote for, being Mickey Rooney, I believe. And
wow, I never saw Hader do Rooney. That would be something. Yeah.
I'm trying. Kevin Pollak, who was in the movie with Jack Nicholson, he did a podcast like this, and he had Bill Hader do the impression. Oh. And for years, Mickey Rooney, of course, in the 30s and 40s and 50s, even probably the early 30s, was a successful megastar, one of the most biggest stars at that point. And then, of course, financially, he sort of fell apart, and that affected him a great deal. When you worked with him at that point, many years after his fame, what was that like in terms of the star that he once was, but also in terms of creatively?
It was just like, in his way, and we didn't spend that much time with him personally because his office was out in Westlake Village, which is maybe 30 miles, almost 30 miles west of us. We were on the phone with him all the time.
Sure.
It's a bit like working with Johnny, or let's say with Daltrey or with George Carlin. You're looking at them and you're concentrating on what needs to be done, and every now and then you look up and go, "It's George Carlin." You know, you live that. And we used to wonder too if talk show hosts are the same way. You know, like Carson adored Jack Benny and
Sure.
Stare and Jimmy Stewart, and he'd be sitting behind a desk and they were coming on his show. These people who had been the movie stars of his youth. Well, we had written a letter to Mickey saying, "Do you need gag writers?" when we were 19 or 20 and living in Florida for some reason for a while. And I don't know where we mailed it, but anyway, we didn't hear back from him. He was the top box office star in the world for nearly 15 years. And a star so long that, like, when John Dillinger came out of that theater that the FBI had cornered him and they shot him to death in the 30s in the alleyway, the film Dillinger had just watched, Mickey Rooney was in it.
Wow.
That's how deep he went into showbiz. So he was in his 50s, I guess, when we met him, and as fired up. He had been through the drinking stages and he'd been bankrupt and was coming out of it with this huge stage show, Sugar Babies, which ran on Broadway for more than a year, maybe even more than 2 years. And then he took it around with Ann Miller and Harry Anderson to all the towns in America, you know. But when he started taking it around, he realized he needed fresh material for every town. Philadelphia, it's not the same jokes as New York. And decided he needed material for Halloween, you know, or if it's voting day today, or if it's July 4th next week, he wanted special material. And that's what we we've been doing it for other people he'd never heard of, but somebody slipped him our names and he just started hiring us. And so we would get a phone call in his weird little guy, crazy, energetic staccato, I'm gonna be in Philadelphia next week, so brotherly love, cream cheese, Liberty Bell, the Flyers, go, and click. And then we'd have to call his attorney or his accountant and say, hi, Mickey wants some stuff. Oh, what do you want now? Let me talk him out of it. And he would call Mickey back and Mickey would say, no, the guys are great. I need the jokes. And he'd call us back, say, how much do you want? And so that went on for, I don't know, 2 or 3 years. It overlapped because we started with Mickey in 84. It overlapped with the Tonight Show. And then he started calling us up and asking if he could get on the Tonight Show to promote whatever he was doing. But he never had something big enough for the bookers to want him. I think he had some trouble with Johnny in the past. But we kept writing with him through, we did a movie or two with him that didn't get made, and we wrote his personal appearance material. We did a 2-man show with him and Donald O'Connor to play in Las Vegas. We wrote a 1-man show called Mickey Rooney in Mickey Rooney, which, as I said to him, is a great title, but a tight fit. And we did a rewrite of Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum for him. When he said he wanted material, I said, it's one of the classic books in the why don't you just keep the book and rewrite the songs? But he rewrote it with us. We went through, you toured it. We went to the Pantages and saw him do it. Yeah, it's an out-of-body experience. But you go in and out of body, you can't, especially if you're working, you can't be staring at the person. I mean, especially writing for, we started off just going and seeing comedians in bars and in clubs in Toronto, and you'd watch them and think, oh, okay, so I get it. He had 6 sisters, that drives him crazy. I can just imagine that. And he's got that little thing with his voice he does. And then you just go by, you go somewhere and you try to imitate them on the page. I thought we were pretty good at that even before we started working for people we'd heard of, people we knew. But when it came to like Carson, I mean, we knew the show so well. And for Mickey, he just wanted a lot of jokes and he wanted them fast. He would call me up and say, how's it going? And I'd say, it's going pretty good. We're working on a stage play for him, a musical, which we also scored. And he said, has it got a lot of jokes in it? And I said, oh yeah, we've got a whole separate book here for the jokes. And he just went, yeah, and hung up. So that's what it was like working for Mickey, who was, I'm sure he was just impossible to be in person.
Well, for me and for myself, I mean, I grew up when he was near the end of his career during the Night Museum movies about 15, 20 years ago. And that's, of course, it's nothing what it was like when he was younger. So it's always an example. And someone like yourself, Steve Stoliar, who was friends with Groucho Marx and a bunch of other people from that generation who got to experience these legendary people who were much more than you could ever imagine. And it's that moment where you have to say, like Johnny, where of course, big star, you're like, how the hell am I here? But then also realizing that this could end very quickly if I let that go to my head. So I have to balance that to a
you
certain
say the wrong
extent.
thing. Yeah, suddenly you're not there. Dick Cavett, who had walked up to Groucho Marx one day when he saw them on the sidewalk in New York and said, Mr. Marx, I'm a huge fan. And it was a hot day and Groucho said, I could use a big fan. And so he made Dick laugh, and then Dick walked alongside him and they became really solid friends. Dick said that he often would be sitting at his house and talking to him, and and he was complaining about, oh, this is warm again, don't we have any more ice? And he would say, don't you realize you're Groucho Marx? It didn't seem possible that he said that there could be such a thing as a room which contained me and Groucho Marx. And when he wanted to just shake him and say, what does it feel like? And of course, it's the end of the rainbow. It's not there. There is nothing. What it feels like is to be the celebrity on the red carpet is nothing at all what it looks like. I have a feeling about glamour kind of not existing. Glamour is for people to imagine other people having. The people you're awed by, they're stressed about the next show, or else they're doing a show and they don't know if the camera makes them look good from this angle, and they're about to have to talk to somebody who some beautiful actress, and smile and ask her questions when they've Googled nude pictures of her online, and there's so much going on in their lives and in the show, the difficulty of the show. And just before they went on, they heard a rumor that they were being canceled, and everybody's life is so complicated. It's not just being Groucho Marx. He had dental problems, and I don't know what else. You spend enough time with enough people, and I think if you're sensitive enough, you do you know enough not to cross that line of familiarity and start slapping on the back,
Sure.
Johnny, whack. But on the other hand, Johnny, after a while, because we started going to his house every
Yeah.
Monday after a few years, did open up and I think got to see that we weren't just the writers down there, a box somewhere producing paper. He saw us come in with our little stories about, getting a flat. Or in fact, he saw me changing a flat once and stopped and asked me why I didn't call AAA. I said, "Are you kidding? You know how much that would cost?"
Johnny could afford it, but at the time you probably were like,
yeah. Oh no, we were doing pretty good. And the
Yeah.
idea was he knew how much
Yeah.
you were making because he was paying it. But fame is such a weird thing. The oldest quote about fame is fame, the bitch goddess. So it's a goddess, but also it's harsh to you. But the people who are suffering from
Yeah.
fame, you can't complain. How are you
Yeah.
going to complain when everybody thinks that you never cook a meal and you've never been in a grocery store
Sure.
since you were discovered? And none of it's true. And they get zits like everybody else, and a bad back, and not enough sleep, and then everybody knows me. Yeah.
It's an interesting story. Well, Martin Short tells a great story, and I won't go into it right now, but a great story of sitting next to Katharine Hepburn at some performance, and he's talking to her like just a regular person would do, and then he suddenly realizes who it was, and she says thank you, and then sits up and tells the person next to him to switch seats with them, and then he sort of flops the center. There's a clip on it all over the place, and Martin's another name I want to bring up momentarily with Johnny.